everybody. Derek Harp here, founder and chairman of CSA and the host of the CSA Online series. And I'm excited to bring you another one today. Not only new speakers who've not been on our stage, but a brand new partner for us that we announced last week, Foxguard. We're super excited to have them on board. And today you're going to hear from two of their top folks, Jay Gignac and Roger Rademacher. And so I'll get a few things out of the way as we normally do, and then I'll invite Jay and Roger to the stage, so to speak, and we'll get going. So let's do a poll like we always do. We're gonna do 3 of those today. And for those of you that have been with us before, you know my spiel on that. It's part of participating in the research that we are always doing. So that does help us with our disposition. We gather 2 to 3 polls over 50 events a year. It's a lot of data, and it's part of our input from hearing from all of you about various things. But it has another purpose. It really helps our speakers like Roger and Jay today have a little bit of perspective of who they're talking to, and that's really a major benefit to any professional speakers to be able to sort of tune or maybe adjust some of their messages, having an understanding of the audience. So we're typically pretty broad, pretty diverse audience, but this gives them a little bit of an insight. So I'll let this go for a minute while people are also coming in every second here, and then we'll share the results with them. All right, let me share that and give everybody a sense of who's here today. So we're nearly half no asset inventory, and then the rest in a distribution of sort of different statuses of inventory. All right, well, I think that's helpful. Okay, so let's keep going, and people are still coming in. If you've not joined us before, we are a 501c6 nonprofit workforce organization. So we have a goal of bringing more people to this workforce, working on cybersecurity specific to control systems, but control systems of all types. Sometimes people get in their head a particular vertical. Energy comes to mind a lot. But the truth is, we look at 18 verticals, anything with cyber to physical elements, moving parts in the real world that are networked now, that are connected by some one or more communication protocols, and often can trace their way to other networks, in an enterprise, or even with some of their manufacturers. So it's become a challenging situation with a lot of older technology, and has special needs. It's got unique people that are different than the IT workforce working on traditional IT cybersecurity. So we need to bring more people in, but then also support them and help build bridges between lots of different kinds of stakeholders that have to work well to conquer this particular problem area. We've been growing now for 9 years. We just not too distant past 33,000 people who signed up in our overall community. Being a member of our community has no cost. Coming to these events live, we can maintain this at no cost. And so that's our largest population, is the people all over the world that are worried about this and working on this, and can benefit from us getting the wisdom of the few people, relatively speaking, in the world that really understand this problem space, and so helping them get their wisdom out to the many. And that's certainly part of our platform and part of our goal. We have another new sponsor to announce as of 2 days ago, and this will be Phosphorus. And so we'll have an event in the next month or two with them. Super excited to have them on board. So that's two great new sponsors, Foxguard and Phosphorus, in the last month, and we're super excited to have both parties on board, and certainly have speakers today from Foxguard. Sponsorship is 80% of our revenue, and these are our strategic partners that are doing annual campaigns. We call them strategic alliance partners. They often, almost all of these companies, are supplying sweat equity in addition to capital support for the nonprofit association. They're doing project work as well, and that's how our small staff scales. It's one of the ways we scale. I'm going to talk about another one today, committees. We're looking to scale even more this year, and that's really by helping members, but it starts with all these partners. So thank you to them, and obviously thank you to Foxguard, which is underwriting today and bringing us some new knowledge. But thank you to all these folks, and then companies that have sponsored anything, a page, a report, or a single event, and you can see we've had just an amazing group of companies that are sponsoring various aspects throughout the last couple of years. This will be CEU ready today. We will issue continuing education unit certificates for those of you maintaining certifications. If there's ever an issue or a question around this, you can email ce@cs2a.org. I will go ahead and beat you to the punch. We always get a question that somebody says, I joined and I didn't get my certificate. We can tell with the software for people who are active for over an hour, they are the only recipients of these. So we do try to keep some integrity to this, that you're involved and active in today's presentation and learning from it. Then you can get this, but logging in and logging out shortly thereafter disqualifies you. And I hope everybody appreciates that. Membership, though, is a growing source of additional financial support for the organization, and I'm always trying to figure out where to toe the line. I like community, and we help each other, and let's educate, and let's talk, and let's swap stories. It's where this began 8 years ago for me in Atlanta, Georgia, or 9 years ago, and the cities that it spread to, Houston and Washington, D.C. next. It was all about let's get together and help each other, and let's not sell. At the time, I was representing a vendor that I was a co-founder of, and I put the rule out there, so let's not sell. But there is some selling that has to happen, and one of them is we need financial support. You know, we're growing. We're trying to do more programming for all of you. We're trying to keep these events free for the greater community. But if you want access to a growing group of benefits and you want to help support us, and we try to keep the price very low, it's $139 a year. My appeal to you is join, become a member. It is very low cost and has a number of benefits. One of which is a significant benefit all by itself without any other benefit. All the recordings of all these experts going back to 2000 or to 2018, I believe, 135 recordings, 240 hours of which, and 43 have been modified for CEU on demand, which means you can self-administer a process with a quiz and get your CEU certificate without any human intervention. Those are global member benefits. Those are reserved for our paying members. It's only $129 a year. But that is a treasure trove of knowledge that you can search in different ways and find the particular presentation that you wanted that has some statistics or a great speaker. Just the treasure trove. It's a deep subject matter pool, and that is just one. That's the longest standing benefit, but one of the ones that people use to justify it. And most businesses are reimbursing membership in our association. So the technology survey is open. We're extending it into 2024. We are beginning to write the report now. We will be shortly. That will be the OT Cybersecurity Technology Report. The title sponsor that underwrote this and kicked it off was Radiflow. We're super grateful to them. Waterfall and Ampere joined to support the project overall, and a lot of people have taken it. This is geared to asset owners. It's not really possible for other people to take it. The context of the questions are around solutions that people are using and that they're happy with or not happy with and dissatisfied with or feel they've gotten good return on investment. We're trying to really measure the landscape of what people are deploying and how happy they are with some of those just choices they're making. This is going to be super valuable to the ecosystem for us to turn around that report, which again won't have a cost because it's underwritten by sponsors. So if you are an asset owner, end user of any type, any category, any industry, I urge you to take this. If you're a consultant working at an asset owner, you can answer the same questions. There's no disclosure of who the company is or who's taking the survey. So we don't know that. We just know, the industry type and, some things like that to be able to say, here's what's true in the universe of asset owners of various types. So if you can help us spread the word about this and maybe get somebody else to take it. If you have any desire to help us get some more respondents for this, just email input@csa.org and we'll take you up on that and give you whatever you need to support that. We do need some help getting more statistically valid responses in all the categories. We've got some nice data already, but we're not quite there on our desired total goal. Some great events coming up. We're entering our season where every week, for the foreseeable future, we've got some excellent events by some well-known experts in the space. I encourage you to check them out. You can sign up for them today. And then last but not least, our first bigger format event, the symposiums that we do. The next one is set. It's March 20, and it is going to be a guide to reports and papers in this industry. We're going to feature some data discussions from some of our two reports, the one we led by KPMG and the one led by Radiflow. But there's going to be other reports and papers from the industry, Fortinet and KPMG being just two of the sponsors signed up so far. We are also building a permanent online resource, a web page listing reports and papers specific to our common space. So if you imagine sort of a way to find at any time different reports, search on different criteria, and find this huge amount of work done by so many subject matter experts out there. We're just trying to coalesce those and organize those in one go-to location. That'll be a free resource again, and we'll debut or expose the first version of that resource at this event. Make sure everybody understands where it is and how it can be used. You can join a committee to work on that resource page or on the next one that's forming, which will be standards and regulations. Very similar in design. That'll also be featured at an event in May, and we'll be thanking both committees on their permanent web pages for the resources and at those events. So if you join these committees, there's a chance to be also involved in sort of a process in culminating with an event and a rollout of these resources. So you just imagine one is a list of the ultimate list of reports and papers in our space, and the other one is regulations and standards and a way to sort of search those and see how many are there. And obviously everybody knows about 62443 or NERC, but there are others, and there are derivatives of those around the world. We're going to try to capture that in a comprehensive list as well. So if you ask a quality question today, you can be entered in the prize drawing for later in the day. This is a question for Roger and Jay to answer. You can ask any questions today. Our staff's all here. If you have a membership-based question or anything, ask it. You'll get it answered. But quality questions are ones that we all get to benefit from hearing our speakers today answer. And so that's what interests you in the prize wheel specifically at the end of the day. Okay, if you want me to quote you, just say quote me and put your question into the question bank of GoToWebinar, and I'll try my very best to actually reference who submitted that question. Okay. All right. So if you're playing the passport game, there'll be another passport stamp today. If you don't know what this is, I think this is really important. People do this every week. Just put it in chat, and our team will answer what the passport game is. It's a long term of collecting a code word at each of these events, and then we will be giving away cash drawings later this year for everybody that's got entries. And every entry is another chance to win thousands of dollars at this point. I'm hoping to up the pool with more sponsor support, but it's already a couple $1,000 that we're going to give away. And so this is something you can play by coming along. Some of you that loyally come to a lot of events, collect that code word in each day. So ask the staff how it works if you don't know, and we'll get to it. So last poll of the day, and then let's get to our speakers. So here it is. How do you manage vulnerabilities and remediation in your organization? So I'll give this a second and then invite my speakers to come on, and we'll get kicked off here. All right, let me just give that another second. Hoping to get a few more data points, and I'm going to go ahead and due to time, I'm going to share it. So there we go. No dedicated process, 11%. I can't identify but not categories, 32. So that's the winner group. It looks like any sort of even distribution of those last three categories. I'll leave that up for our speakers for a second, and I'll get ready to close that out. All right, and let's go. Let's bring Jay and Roger on. I will pass control.
Appreciate the intro. So maybe quick introductions. Jay Gignac. So I've been in the cybersecurity industry going on 20 years now. Took a left turn about 10 years ago and headed into OT, and I haven't looked back since. So I've had the pleasure of working with many organizations, both globally and regionally in Canada and the US, Europe, Australia. So it's a pleasure to be here today, and I'll let Roger introduce himself, and then we can dive into the content.
Sure, thanks, Jay. Roger Rademacher. I've been in the OT industry since around 2014. Prior to that, 10 years in the Marine Corps, predominantly DoD spaces. It's been an interesting change. Go ahead, Jay.
Thank you. If you want to move to the next slide. Since you're driving, so we're gonna do a quick introduction, present the company, some of our history. We'll talk about our approach, or essentially what we consider to be important in securing OT and maintaining a continuous healthy posture. Essentially after that, I would hand this over for the technical content to Roger, and we'll be available, of course, both of us to answer questions. Hopefully there will be some after the main session. So a little bit about us, right? So someone once told me that we're the best kept 40-year-old secret, and I both love that and I hate that, in the sense that for the customers that do know us, we're not a secret. We've done a lot of great work over the entire history that we've had, founded back at the start of the 80s, combining a very unique approach to securing OT, both on the industrial computing side. So we've got a number of success stories based on producing security equipment, both ruggedized and non-ruggedized, assisting customers and OEMs with their own projects. We can talk about hardened security appliances, custom compute, as well as industrial PLCs, HMIs that were produced for a wide range of customers out there today. And the uniqueness is that we also have deep domain cybersecurity expertise in all of the OT security ecosystem, from assessments to build and run services, as well as remedial work and deep expertise, especially around remediation management and patch management that goes back a very long time. So essentially, one of the big things that happened to Foxguard in the last few years is Foxguard was acquired by Framatome. Framatome is less well known in the cybersecurity world, especially in OT, I would say. Framatome is a global nuclear services and engineering company that has a very tight relationship today with Foxguard, which plays perfectly with one of the deep knowledge set that we have around NERC-CIP, as well as obviously the nuclear sector. And we bring best practice approaches to all industrial environments today. Move on to the next slide, please, Roger. Perfect. So let's talk about what brings us to the conversation today. Essentially, one of the things that we've noticed, and that I've noticed being in the industry for a long time, is we've gone through different phases of trying to help customers understand their environments. And some of the findings that we have, and I was looking at the poll, the very first poll, which reflects very much statistically what we see out there. Half to, 2/3 of many customers have some sort of asset inventory. It's probably dispersed through a number of things, maybe CMDB, maybe not, Excel-based approaches, and essentially they end up with different sources of asset information that lie in multiple solutions, whether that's a DCS or SCADA or EMS or IT tools or a combination thereof, trying to bring this information back to a common platform. It's proved to be challenging for them to bring information back and consolidate that information in order not to have duplicates, not to have gaps, not to have time-based gaps in the sense of maintaining the inventory over time and reflect changes that are made within those environments. Even though we say that OT is static, from a global perspective, especially if you have multiple sites, not so much. There's constant change happening in many environments, and we want to make sure that the asset inventory reflects that and is as much as possible automated to reflect reality at all times. And this is essential. So we understand that the foundation of a good OT security program starts with assets. And as much as over the last decade, we've gone from asset-based programs to vulnerability-led programs to risk-led programs now, essentially we still understand that the asset plays a key role. The better job we do at identifying the asset, understanding where it lies, its role, its criticality, as well as getting as much information as possible from a technical perspective, especially when it comes to differentiating assets and their versions, this then allows us to do a better job downstream. So if I can get a better asset inventory, I can then consolidate information from relevant data sources, from visibility vendors to network devices, to network traffic analysis, to traditional routing and switching tools, to security infrastructure. And ideally, the approach would allow you to bring this information back and then start identifying available vulnerabilities and available patches or remediation and mitigation framework that would accompany the information that you're able to assess. Now, we found that in talking to global organizations as well as many players in different regions, that essentially one of the big hurdles to crossing from pillar 1 to pillar 2 has been the relevancy of this information to the security practitioners or even operations or performance management. So if I don't know the health, or I don't know the specifics of this asset and its context, it makes it difficult then to understand if the said vulnerabilities contextually are applicable to the environment. What is good for me as an asset owner is that I understand criticality and I understand exploitability, and that I have a time-bound structure around making these changes. And this will vary from vertical to vertical, and of course, if it's a regulated environment or non-regulated. But essentially, everyone that we speak to has expressed the need to manage remediation, mitigation, and patches, and wants to do so in a structured approach. So as we developed an approach that reflects what market need is, we essentially pivot from consolidating assets to presenting and identifying availability of and risk tied to vulnerabilities and of course patches. And then moving forward, we would bring this into decision assistance. So we often hear decision tree or decisioning process, which is essentially prioritizing the changes that are required to the environment. So we want to highlight both available and recommended remediations, mitigations, and workarounds potentially, and this will require an interaction between customer, vendor, service provider, and potentially additional operational teams, so that make sure that we have a complete picture. So having a standardized platform or a workbench, if you will, that allows us to bring all this information and present it in a concise, organized, and prioritized manner helps everyone in the organization. And this is essentially what we're recommending, is that this decision assistance, highlighting both risk level, criticality, exploitability, and also effort and impact in regards to the changes that are required, then helps us provide, or we find that the need is present in the industry to have remediation planning. And this remediation planning will take many different forms, depending again on asset owner size, on multi-site versus more regional players, as well as having hard requirements or operational constraints around this. So designing a remediation plan, working hand in hand, able to reflect that reality, and also emphasizing that it would be great if everything could be patched, but unfortunately that's not so much the reality out there, and therefore we need to be able to customize a plan and develop a plan of action that would highlight differences between needs, wants, as well as providing a roadmap forward in order to prevent exploitability and manage risk, whether that's even moving something over to the risk register temporarily, understanding that there's a permanent remediation that can be done at a later date, or that there is an active mitigation that can be put in place today. So we want to make sure that we also address compliance standards here and make sure that we have a compliance check, and that's definitely part of the process. And when I say compliance, that could also reflect framework as well as internal governance in terms of setting up what the objectives and the goals are of the program, and performing this ideally in a continuous process so that we're never exposed for longer than we have to be. And we all know how risk can escalate very quickly in these environments. And that's something that we want to make sure that we address as part of a continuous process. And we feel that this approach covers in a repeated way, in a consistent and predictable way, an approach to managing risk within OT environments. So I would stop here and I would pass this over to Roger to lead us into the more technical presentation.
Sure, thanks, Jake. So what Jake just pointed out was essentially a linear understanding of what that virtuous loop, what that continuous process is. And for the sake of putting it on the screen here, I'm just getting the whole thing up here. The virtuous loop as a continuous process, it starts with asset identification, but in all honesty, wherever you are in the maturity of your solution, this virtuous loop starts. It's always gonna loop back on itself. But to go over briefly and build upon what Jay has identified, is that we start with asset consolidation. And this takes into consideration all of the various sources that we have within the organization. Whether you're a large organization or a small organization, 1 business unit, 20 business units, you have 1 air gap system, 100 air gap systems. Depending on what your patch and vulnerability management program scope is, determines how you're going to consolidate that information. Are you going to consolidate it at the business unit and then present that at a higher level, or are you going to consolidate it across the entire organization in a standardized way, or with significant requirements that allow roll-up to be standardized? But bringing all those assets together give you an understanding of what it is that you have. I'm not going to belabor the point on understanding that this problem alone has not gone away ever since I've been in the OT industry. I continue to discuss with customers, and the poll showed this, that asset consolidation, having a database that represents 100% or near 100% of your environment, continues to be a significant problem. And the reason for that will become apparent later on, but the largest reason for that is because of the lack of standardization on how data from these assets can be gathered using the various approaches. Once you have that asset database, the contextualization portion of this, there are multiple ways to look at contextualization. One of the primary problems we ran into as a company when we first started helping customers develop their asset databases was not simply understanding the assets they had or how critical they were. It was that we had to help them understand what to call their assets in order to go out into the real world and find information related to those assets. Some customers that we've worked with asset databases in the hundreds of thousands of line items would have Microsoft in there, 4 different spellings, multiple vendor reiterations. Sometimes it was MS, sometimes it was Microsoft. So having a consistent way of naming your assets that can be associated with the real world, whether that's through a CPE string, which we'll talk about later, using common platform enumeration into the NVD or another database. Just having a common understanding of what your assets are and understanding that there's standardization around what that means allows us to go and get that information, whether it's vulnerability information or patch information or it's CIS benchmark weaknesses or STIGs, having access to the security information, whatever that security information is that we can associate with our assets, we can associate with the configurations of our assets to identify what those vulnerabilities are, what those weaknesses are, what we need to do to change those assets, to harden them, reduce the attack surfaces, and remove the opportunity for the bad guys essentially to take advantage of those, whether they're coming in from remote or they're insider threats that are already on the network. Once you know what your vulnerabilities and your weaknesses are, you're going to look at the prioritizing those vulnerabilities according to the assets, right? If you have a low critical asset sitting off in a corner somewhere that's air gapped, not connected to anything, even if an insider threat has access to that, they can't pivot anywhere else. The vulnerabilities that are associated with that asset, even if those vulnerabilities are very high level vulnerabilities, they can walk up to and own the machine in 5 seconds. You may not necessarily care about those vulnerabilities. So when we talk about risk-based prioritization, you take into consideration the assets criticality along with the vulnerability itself, the exploitability of that vulnerability. When making a decision on when you're going to act on that vulnerability, you may wait to patch those low critical, high vulnerability assets to a particular maintenance cycle. But if you've got a high critical asset with a pending ransomware attack on it, that's something that you may want to expedite in your patch management processes. We're going to end today's presentation around patch analysis, and then we're going to save the other half of this remediation portion of the virtuous loop for the next presentation. So to jump right into this, from an asset consolidation standpoint, there are a number of ways we can get assets into a single database or a standardized database shared across business units, just to make things easier for us on a roll-up standpoint. The primary way we want to get assets, particularly in OT environments, into an asset database is something that is consistent with the configuration management process, right? Configuration management review boards, changes are happening in these environments. Jay indicated that sometimes you may not have changes happening a lot in a specific environment, but across the entire organization, changes are happening all the time. So the scope that you have for your patch management program is dependent upon, the scope impacts how often those changes are going to be happening. So at the very highest level, if your patch and vulnerability management program has a configuration management review board or configuration management processes that are approving everybody else's work, or at least having visibility into that, those configuration management processes are a good way to maintain your asset inventories, particularly because a lot of the assets we run into require manual entry into a database somewhere. Assign a database identifier, go get the information, put that in the asset database, and then upon a change through the configuration management process, then update the database. For a lot of assets, that is the only way we can get asset information to remain consistent, is through these manual processes. And then there's the off chance that an asset will change and you don't know about it because someone did not follow configuration management processes in the environment. So periodic walkdowns, whether it's an annual, biannual, monthly, the purpose of those walkdowns can change, but periodic walkdowns allow us to identify that information has in fact either remained the same or changed. Some of the sites that I've been to, they will have monthly walkdowns of their systems, looking for things like rogue detection of equipment. This switch is only supposed to have 8 cables plugged into it. I see 9. What is the extra cable? And it kicks off a process trying to figure out what that is. Obviously, if the picture that I have when I'm doing my walk down shows 8 cables and there's 9 cables on the device, I need to figure out where that 9th cable came from. So that's part of the configuration management process, is making sure that that information stays consistent so that during the walk downs, you can look at the devices and really quickly see what those changes are. And then if those devices have any type of an HMI interface on them, whether it's an LCD screen or a full-on, Windows, Linux, QNX video display unit, you can look at the system information on those screens. Hopefully the HMI applications have a maintenance mode or a maintenance window of some type that you could access without having to affect operations, and get lists of all the software that are on those and the configurations and things like that, or be able to plug a thumb drive into it without affecting operations and pull that kind of information during a walk down, particularly if those devices don't have any way of being centrally managed. Get that per device configuration, bring that back to a central location, analyze that configuration to make sure that there have or have not been any changes to those devices. And then we have monitoring systems, whether we have passive or active monitoring systems. Those monitoring systems allow us to sniff the network, see the traffic that's going on, identify rogue devices, which kicks off a process of going and tracking down that rogue device. If we see that there's a new IP address, we can use the switching network configurations to determine where that IP address is coming in physically to help us kind of narrow down where in a plant that device may be connected, but track down those rogue devices if there are new IP addresses popping on the network. But then more active systems. So you can reach out with native language capabilities of individual devices and query those devices to say, hey, who are you? Who made you? What version are you? Is there any other information I need to be cognizant of to keep in mind for you, given our patch vulnerability management program? Some other things to consider while looking at assets from a contextualization standpoint is how critical is that asset? When we talk about the criticality of an asset, we're talking about, if I lose this asset, what is the operational impact? So in NERC SIP, we look for things like the asset goes down and it has the ability to, or the ramifications of impacting operations within 15 minutes, right? There are certain bright line criteria that we look at with NERC SIP. Some of that bright line criteria is coming over into the nuclear space from a power generation standpoint. But realistically, for whatever environment you have, whatever process you have, a single asset has some type of operational impact, right? If I lose this asset, then what? Now, that operational impact also needs to consider the direct connect capabilities of that asset. So if I have an HMI sitting here, if I lose that HMI, that's okay, it's redundant. I may not necessarily care about that HMI from the standpoint if I lose it, but that HMI is connected to the other HMI. It's connected to the other devices that I have in my network. If that HMI is compromised, then I can pivot from that in order to compromise something else. So when you talk about the operational impact of your assets, it's not just simply this asset is important. It's this asset is part of a group of assets that have common connectivity, and something in that group actually is important, right? So the most important thing in that group ends up directing how critical everything else is in that group, which is why, particularly in the early days of NERC SIP, we were doing a lot of segmentation efforts to move non-critical assets away from critical assets, establish the routing, the one-way data diodes and whatnot, in order to lessen the operational impact that certain devices had, in order to affect the program, the patch and vulnerability management program scopes for those processes. Beyond operational impact, once you understand that this thing has or could have via pivot an impact on the environment, we look at the business impact. A good example, there was a coal plant in Virginia that I went to, and they had an environmental system, and they had a business case where the plant would run with the environmental system completely offline because it didn't impact operations in any way. It was a reporting mechanism, but they had a policy that if that system were offline for more than 30 days and they couldn't get it back online, then they would shut the plant down, right? So there are certain business processes that can impact the operational stability of the well, not stability, but the operational progress of the installation or the line or whatever the industrial process is. So understand that there are situations where business impact can have a significant degree of influence over how you're going to be handling the patches and vulnerabilities from a prioritization standpoint. Taking into consideration the operational and business impact, you will establish what that what the criticality group of that asset is. Not every asset is going to have a different criticality. For a lot of locations, we tend to generalize and we say we've got low critical assets, moderate critical assets, and then high critical assets, just as a way of helping us prioritize which patches we need to pay attention to and what the timelines associated with remediating those particular patches and vulnerabilities happens to be. Some other things to consider that not everybody has had an opportunity to, because we've been focused on, I need to patch or I need to remediate some vulnerabilities. There are other aspects of asset management that as your asset management processes mature, start to come into play, right? At the very high end of asset management are things like configuration baselines, gold configuration baselines, device baselines, and the recipes or the series of commands in order to get those configurations for specific devices. There are a number of vendors now who offer configuration management solutions that will ping your device every day. It will gather a time agnostic version of that configuration, meaning there's no timestamps in those. So that you can take that configuration from day to day to day and compare it to what it looked like the previous day, right? If you don't have a baseline, you can't do this. But if you do have a baseline identified, you can look at those configurations from day to day to day and see changes happening, right? If someone goes into your Cisco device, adds a new user, someone goes on your Windows device and changes privileges, right? If you're looking at those configurations on a day-to-day basis, you can see those changes happening if the SIEM isn't reporting those. And some of these devices don't have syslog capabilities, or it's really hard to get that type of information. Which is why when you're doing your walkdowns from an engineering standpoint, you may actually have your engineers grab configurations on a weekly or a monthly basis, and those configurations can be diffed against the previous configurations to find out those baselines have changed. So it's a good idea to maintain some type of a baseline that's either on a per device basis or something that applies to multiple devices, right? If you've got 10 HMIs that have the exact same configuration, all it's changing is the IP address and host name from a software versioning standpoint, or just a general configuration standpoint, it might be good to have a baseline that applies to all of those, so that when you're grabbing the information from those individual devices and bringing them back and doing a diff on them, you'll see that any one of those devices have changed, whether it's a manual diff or that you actually have an automated system that can allow you to have those capabilities. And you're going to see not as much today, but in the next presentation, there's a lot of discussion around configuration baselines, recipes, maintaining those and checking those and using those as part of the process. The other thing to consider on a per asset basis, other than baselines, is what are the validation requirements for that asset, right? Do I have a vendor SLA in place where the vendor is actually performing tests for me? Because in some cases, the vendor is the integrator. They work with you directly, whether it's a camera system or a speaker system or a safety related system, they work with you directly to deliver a product to your site. And if any patch or vulnerability comes out for that product baseline, they do the testing. And they can attest that they've done the testing. You can come to that agreement that if they've done the testing and their testing is passed, then you don't need to do testing. This is particularly true when you don't do anything else to those devices. You've just configured an IP address on that device. There's no real need for you to go through and do any other testing. So if there's a vendor SLA in place that allows you to have that kind of testing, then by all means take advantage of that. Another good example would be if a Microsoft product has a new patch and you go through your Patch Tuesday processes. As customers or operators or owners of Microsoft products, we're not going through and checking every single functionality of Microsoft Word or Excel or things like that. So there's a level of vendor testing that we assume is being taken care of for us. What we care about generally is, hey, there's a patch to this software. I'm not necessarily using that software from an operational standpoint, but it's on my device. I'm going to install that patch. I'm going to see if anything else breaks. that's specific to my environment. And that's where the integrators come in. An integrator will take all these vendor softwares and applications and hardware and whatnot. And if an integrator has put all these things together for you on a particular HMI and they support that HMI configuration, they can do that kind of testing, particularly if they have an HMI that they use at multiple customer sites, whether it's GE or Toshiba. Those HMIs, because they're rolled out to multiple sites, GE may be doing integrator testing, or Foxguard may be doing some testing on their behalf, and that testing applies to multiple sites. And you may trust that testing is being done, therefore you don't have to run those types of tests. And if your vendor's not doing testing for you, and the integrator's not doing testing for you, and you want to have a third party like Foxguard or another test lab do validation testing for you, we can work and we can develop those requirements that are specific to your environment. Generally, what we look for is the only testing the operator or owner has to do is the testing that no one else can do on your behalf, and attribute those SLAs from an audit standpoint. Once we've determined what is residual, what testing can no one else be responsible for, all the remaining testing would be constitute of the test cases that I have to now run on an every change basis, right? If I do identify there's a patch or mitigation or some type of remediation that has to happen on the network, I now know what my testing requirements are, so that later on in the remediation process, when I get to validation, which again, that will be the next presentation, when we get to that validation step, I know what I have to test for. I've already drafted those test cases while I was onboarding the asset into my database, right? This is the benefit of looking at everything from an asset specific standpoint. Know the baselines for the asset, know the criticality of the asset, know what tests I need to perform every single time there's a change to that asset in order to maintain some semblance of understanding that, yes, this asset is okay, it's not a problem child in our environment. Once you know what your asset database looks like, you have all your assets, you've gotten the contextualization of the assets, how critical they are, what those baselines look like, what those test cases look like. Now we move away from asset specific to a more holistic view of these are all of my assets. I may have 20 of these kinds, 10 of these kinds, maybe one of this particular PLC vendor, but I take that information and I dedupe it down to a master list that is distinct, right? I don't need to look for Microsoft patches 20 times because I got 20 different devices. I look for it once, and I apply that effort to all the devices that relate to that particular source. So there's three primary sources we have for information, for patches and vulnerabilities. And this isn't all the information that we're looking for, but for the point of this presentation, let's limit it to patches and vulnerabilities. So for government-funded programs, we're looking at your NVDs, your CISA, your ANSI, a government-funded organization or a government-backed, program that collects security-related information, whether it's a list of patches or it's a list of vulnerabilities, it's a list of weaknesses, whatever that source is. It's a government-created program. What you're going to find there, particularly in the NVDs, there's a lot of vulnerabilities, and most of them will have some type of remediation associated with those, whether it's go change this registry configuration or go put this firewall rule in place, or heaven forbid, go install this actual patch to relieve ourselves of that vulnerability. Anything other than installing that patch as a remediation may have some residual risk associated with it. So we prefer to install the patches to reduce our residual risk, but in operational environments where we can't install that patch, which we'll talk about in the prioritization standpoint, in operational environments where we can't install that patch, perhaps doing a remediation is the best step there. Public sources. So public sources, although things like the NVD are considered open to the public and anybody in the public can contribute to those, public sources here are things like GitHub, ExploitDB, your Metasploit databases, public sources of vulnerabilities that exist that identify there are exploits associated with these vulnerabilities. Absorb those, use those against, associate those to the assets to understand the full scope of risks. Not everything is reported to the NVD. Some things stay in the GitHub for open source projects, or some things stay here lastly on the vendor websites. The vendors may not report to the NVD, particularly if they're not at the US. So if you have vendor websites, whether it's Cisco or SCL or Allen Bradley or Rockwell, if you have vendor websites that publish a list of security concerns, security notices, actual vulnerabilities, or just a list of firmware changes. Keep track of those sources. Quick anecdote on vendor websites. There are vendors who have backdated information, right? So in our dealings with NERC CIP, we will go to a vendor website, and from our standpoint, we take pictures of evidence and collect to make sure that when we went to go visit that website, nothing was there of any particular concern, because we have seen, from month to month, information appear on websites that looks like it's been there for 3 months. So if you do have, internally a mining process of going out and getting information from government and public and vendor sources and pulling that information in and associating with your asset database, make sure that if you're executing those processes that you are capturing evidence of, because the last thing you need is for an auditor to come in and say, hey, you missed this piece of firmware, you're 5 months out of date. If you've got the evidence to say, well, I just looked last month, that wasn't published, and this month it popped up 5 months out of date, that is not, something that we're directly responsible for. In fact, if you've got month after month of evidence being collected as part of your mining processes, you will see this happening on a number of vendor websites. And that's because they'll push a patch, or they'll push information out there, it'll be wrong, they'll pull it back, and then later on they'll put it back out there in its corrected state. So just pay attention to the sources and capturing the evidence for that information as you get it to support your auditing. So you have assets, you have vulnerabilities related to those assets, or any change in reality. So it could be there's a vulnerability with the patch, a vulnerability with the remediation. It could be a vulnerability with nothing associated with it. It's just literally, here's a vulnerability. We have no idea how to solve for this, right? There's no action that you can take right now. And we can discuss that again next time. If you have a vulnerability that's got no identified mitigation or patch, the question is whether or not you're going to research trying to develop your own mitigation for that vulnerability when no one has said anything. It's rare that a vendor can't suggest something, but there are vulnerabilities that are pushing to the NVD that are not from the vendor, that are from a third party, just for the sake of saying, hey, there's a vulnerability. The prioritization of those vulnerabilities takes into consideration a number of things that allow us to narrow down our scope for what we actually want to pay attention to. The first thing we want to pay attention to, particularly for patches, predominantly for patches, is this even a security-related patch, right? Does the vendor tell you this is a security patch or a security-related patch or a potential security-related patch? Is this a patch that I need to pay attention to, or is this patch simply a feature change, right? You may not care about feature changes. You may only care about patches. You should be only caring about patches that are security-related from the standpoint of trying to prioritize those patches. Now, if you need a new feature in your environment, by all means, add those features to your environment, but you shouldn't be following your patch and vulnerability management process to add new features. That is strictly a configuration management process. If you want to add something new, go through that process, do a security evaluation on those new features prior to implementing those. Don't try to implement new features through a patch and vulnerability management program. If it's an existing feature, if it's a security patch for an existing feature, look at your criticality thresholds. So we talked about before criticality, a combination of criticality of the device and the criticality of the vulnerability, the cross section of those two determining the overall criticality and prioritization of that patch or change. When you're looking at criticality thresholds, you may have a standing rule. If it's a CVSS score of 4 or lower, I don't care about it, right? I have seen this in organizations before, right? I don't care what the criticality level is of my equipment. If it's a CVSS score of 4 or below, I simply don't care about it. And that is certainly a way of weeding out, some of the things that have very little value. Generally, low CVSS score vulnerabilities have very little in the way of exploitation, which is why they have a low score. And even if they are exploitable, the ramifications of that exploit tend to be very minimal. So if you have thresholds, understand what those thresholds are. Those thresholds help set timeframes in the as far as prioritization as well. If you have syskev information, if you're taking into consideration exploitability, I have a vulnerability or a security patch related to a vulnerability, and there's an active exploit for it, right? You may want to narrow your processes down to say, hey, I care about things that are exploitable more than things that are non-exploitable. They both may have a CVSS score of 9 or above, marking them as critical or high, but just because the CVSS score is the same doesn't necessarily mean that they're treated the same in the process. So looking as to whether or not there is an exploitability predicted score or a syskev associated with those is a way of narrowing down your focus for what you care about right now versus what you care about a year from now. And then again, take into consideration the criticality groups, right? As we look at these various thresholds of the CVSS scores, it's exploitable, and then now you start looking at your criticality groups. Your most critical groups you want to act on now. Your less critical groups you may want to push off. So the full combination of looking at the various levels of prioritization allow you to, in the end, say, I need to take care of this 15 days, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 180 days, or a year and a half from now, depending on what your maintenance cycles are for the various lines and the various portions of the network that you have. And that is where you start getting your governance capabilities, right? We're not going to talk a whole lot about governance here, but you have to start somewhere, right? I've identified there's a vulnerability. I've prioritized that vulnerability. Now I have to act upon that. You know, I've given myself, based off of the prioritization of that vulnerability in the patch and vulnerability management process, I've given myself a window to either evaluate or remediate or come up with a remediation plan for that vulnerability. And then that starts the clock for the various stages of your process, all the way out to I've finally deployed this thing. So the patch and mitigation analysis process. So this is something that I alluded to earlier. When you have a patch, you don't necessarily have to install that patch. The primary reason is that just because you have the software doesn't necessarily mean that you're using the software or that portion of the software is enabled. Classic example, I've got a Cisco switch, but SSH is turned off. Or I've got a Cisco switch and the web interface is turned off, and you have a vulnerability for specifically SSH or the web interface. So if those features aren't enabled, then you don't necessarily have to do anything with that particular vulnerability, right? You can ignore that vulnerability for now. You can recognize that, yes, it's got that vulnerability, but it doesn't impact my devices because I'm not using that feature. However, if you're using configuration management baselines, if you ever turn that feature on, you should know that it's vulnerable. So it's simply that feature doesn't apply right now. So your process should entertain, from a configuration management standpoint, hey, I've seen this change in the device. It's an unauthorized change. Or if you're going through the configuration management process, you're like, I want to turn on the web interface. You should be able to see here are all the vulnerabilities related to it that we've ignored up until now. Maybe you want to think twice about turning that feature back on. So provided that the software is enabled, the feature is enabled, particularly if it's a hardware feature. If that feature is enabled, you look through in an orderly fashion, has anybody else come up with a mitigation for this patch so that I don't have to install the patch, right? So particularly because that impacts operations. Has the integrator, the person who knows my system other than me, the person who best knows my system, have they come back and said, hey, it'd be a good idea for you to make this one registry change, doesn't impact operations, but that's better than doing this patch because this patch requires a reboot, right? I'd rather not reboot and be mitigated with, essentially zero or residual risk or as close to zero as possible, or do I go ahead and install the patch and reboot as a ramification of that? Outside the integrator, we look at the vendors. Does the vendor recommend a mitigation instead of installing a patch, right? That's always an opportunity. The vendor knows their product better than everybody else. They're in the best possible position to say, yes, we understand there's a security vulnerability. You could install this patch, or this patch is only making this a change that affects this one registry entry. There's the registry entry. So trust your vendors when the integrators don't say anything. And then you always have third parties, whether again it's a Foxguard or KPMG or a testing lab. Your third parties who have representative equipment that supports your network in their environment to support validation testing, which is later on, they can work with you to come up with a mitigation. They can disassemble binaries, find out what's actually going on in the patch, when the vendors, the integrators aren't putting out good release notes. They can look at those patches and they can figure out what exactly it's doing, and they can suggest alternate mitigations. Or they can study the vulnerability itself and say, okay, this is what the vulnerability is doing. You could affect a change on the asset, or you can go onto the network and you can permanently block that if your network supports adding those firewall rules without impacting operations. Worst possible case scenario, if you don't want to install the patch as an operator owner, you investigate your own methodologies for mitigating that patch. And you also run the chance that you've already mitigated this patch and you don't know it. A good example would be the firewall rules. A lot of remote exploits require you to have can be solved by having simple firewall rules in place. A lot of good network designs, period, can mitigate a lot of these vulnerabilities to begin with. So if you have a good network design that limits your the peer-to-peer points or the connections between assets, the zones, the conduits, if you have good network design already in place, a lot of the vulnerabilities simply don't apply because they're already mitigated by good practices from a networking standpoint. Even after all of this, if you've discovered that, you know what, I can't do a mitigation instead of installing this patch, I have to install this patch. The question now is, when do I install this patch? I have a prioritization set in place. I need to do something about this, whether it's, actually, mitigate it or put the patch on the box, or I need to come up with a remediation plan and schedule that it's actually going to be installed, at the next maintenance cycle. There's always the opportunity that the thing that you're patching needs to be patched now. It is so critical that the need to put that patch in place outweighs any operational needs you have right now to making money, particularly with ransomware and things that are affecting your network right now. So that's a situation where, okay, I'm going to go get that patch. I'm going to go and immediately deploy that patch, and we'll talk about that in the next process. But in the event that you've determined that you don't need to install it right now, the risk is not greater than the operational impact, then we move north to, well, what are the validation requirements for putting this patch in place? Which is why, on a per asset basis, at the very beginning of this asset identification contextualization, we talked about what it means to make a change to a particular asset. Do I need to run 1 test, 20 tests? Do I run a settle test? What does that validation test look like? Is it 1 test case, 20 test cases? Do I have 10 HMIs? Do I spot check? Do I use dedicated test equipment, or do I use some type of early adopter system within a strategy within the production environment? Those are all the decisions you have to make from a validation standpoint. And we'll talk about validation, acquisition, and deployment in the next presentation. To give you an idea of what the overall process looks like. So over the years of working with, whether it's been DoD, transit, and now nuclear and non-nuclear entities, there are common requirements for a patch and vulnerability management process that I've seen. And there are a lot of pitfalls that we have ran into over and over and over again, particularly in supporting the audit process, where whether it's a QA issue in following the process, or it's the process is verbal, or the process is loosely understood, or there's like I said, there's you're not keeping positive and negative evidence of patches, and an auditor calls you out and you're like, well, I didn't see it last month. Well, show me that you didn't see it. There's a lot of pitfalls in a patch and vulnerability management process that the longer you're running these processes, the more you can identify those pitfalls and pre-plan for those, right? Adding validation test cases as a research point or an analysis point while you're putting the asset into your database is one of those pitfalls. Because when it comes time to doing validation testing, you're like, well, what am I testing? Well, you don't know at that point. You'd have to develop the test case when you've identified that you need to go through testing, and that's not the point where you want to be developing those test cases. You want to know what those are beforehand, so when it comes time to validate, you're not taking the extra time and shortening your windows to actually remediate those patches and vulnerabilities. We talked about adding the configuration baselines to the process. There are a lot of points in this process, and we're going to see these particularly in the validation step later on in the next presentation. You're going to see that a lot of these processes throughout patch and vulnerability management they pull information and contribute to prior pieces of the process, whether it's through gathering the configuration baselines, testing the configuration baselines in validation, so that when you're going into deployment and you know that those baselines are in fact correct, you can use gold baselines in validation to scan your production environments to identify assets that are out of compliance. And then you could use that to further narrow your scope, just on the off chance that there are assets that are already updated, you don't know about it. So there's a lot that can go into this process. We can easily talk, all day about this. But just understand that the process itself, it can be elaborate, but there are minimums to this. There are certain things that you have to do in order to have some level of impact in removing vulnerabilities and patches and reducing your overall risk, so that you are protected from not only remote but insider threats. And the process itself, depending on how elaborate your process is, allows you to establish the governance of that process, allows you to look at the process and say, is this process effective, right? How long does it take me on average to remediate? Where am I in the process for all the patches of vulnerabilities that I have? So if you don't have a process, it's hard to track where you are in the process. If you don't have dedicated windows where you're bringing information in and analyzing that information to establish some type of commonality, and you're still shotgunning, I'm looking for patches every single day, vice once a month kind of a thing. If that's the way the process is running, those types of shotgun methodologies establish an expected level of chaos in the environments. The more organized and methodical you are with your processes, the easier it is to keep track of the cases that are open versus the cases that are closed, how long everything's taking to get resolved, where am I, what's my residual risk look like right now, what right now do I need to concentrate most on, and then work backwards from the highest critical to the lowest critical. The process drives all of that. It drives the ability to govern. It drives the selection of technology going into the process, or the selection of technologies that are going into the process. So not to belabor too much on the overall process, a lot of this is going to be discussed next time. So I think right now we're going to hand it back over to Derek to see if we have any questions.
You do, in fact. Yeah, but they've been streaming in as you guys have been going. So let's see if I got everything running right here. So thank you for the prepared commentary, and let's dig into some of this if you're ready. There's some sort of probably tactical questions. So the tool you're talking about, is it connected via the cloud for a vulnerability database update, or is it standalone, sort of cloud on-prem questions?
So the presentation is really tool agnostic. It's about going through the process. There are a number of tools you can use to manage patch and vulnerability management, everything from what you're using for asset identification to actually the workflow behind it, right? You could use a Foxguard tool for asset identification. You could use, I hate to say SolarWinds, no one's using SolarWinds now, but SolarWinds have the ability to do this kind of stuff. You can roll your own PowerShell scripts that push into a SQL database. There are so many ways of getting asset information. Just understand that in an OT environment, the vast majority of the assets, there's no centralized solution, right? You're not SSHing out to an Allen Bradley machine in order to pull vendor product version information from an Allen Bradley. If you're lucky, you can sniff it off the network, but realistically, you're walking up to these machines, plugging in a serial cable, or putting it into program mode and remotely connecting through RS links in order to get this kind of information. But that information needs to be put somewhere into a database. So you're going to have a database technology somewhere in your solution. And that's going to be your master asset list, for lack of a better way of describing it. That is your master inventory. SQL query gets that master inventory, dedupe it down, do a distinct query on it, and now you got your master asset list that you could use to go find information. And if you don't have an automated tool, then it's an Excel spreadsheet saying, here's all my assets, and this is the last time I checked them, Or you can develop an Access database in order to keep track of that. But the point is, I've got assets, and that could be one technology. I'm looking for information. That could be another technology. It could be a separate database. The biggest thing that most people flounder on when it comes to asset management, patch and vulnerability management, is the process flow. Where am I with a vulnerability or a patch in the process? And that normally requires something like Jira or ServiceNow or some other type of ITMS solution. That is the lion's share of the work, is the decision-making process behind what to do. So I would say, have an asset database, have a vulnerability database, have an ITMS solution. And between those three, whatever glue you need to put those together, which they all have APIs, whatever glue you need to put those together, that's the culmination of the solution for most folks once they start to understand the process.
Yeah, I'm glad some of the things you mentioned there are really important. There are more than one way to, more than one methodology and tool to do these things, but it's from what I see over the last few years, this is like part of the question of what do I do first? If you don't know where to dumb this down, if you don't know where your stuff is, that's a really good early step, right? You wouldn't be doing let's hire a threat hunting company and have a threat hunting subscription. That would not be next. This would be next. Knowing where your stuff is the basis for many other more mature steps you may make.
Yeah, and to Roger's point, and it's important that we remain educational in this forum. We do have best practice approaches, and our approach has always been based on a combination of both tooling and services. Typically, when we meet the customer where they are at their maturity stage or process maturity, we tend to make suggestions around process adoption, tool adoption, best practice, and fill in the gaps with them. And that may be a service that we render for the customer based on their own capabilities, their maturities, their bandwidth to actually provide this type of function within their security program. Our approach has been based on providing a workbench that pulls this information and actually makes our process much easier. And to answer the question directly, that typically will be on-prem for a customer. There is interaction in pulling down signatures, updates, these kind of things, but essentially we want to respect the customer's governance and operational constraints. In some environments, cloud-based or even hybrid approaches are not possible, whereas in other verticals, as we see sometimes as an example in manufacturing, we have worked with global customers that will accept cloud-based interaction or cloud-based deployment to their environment. So we want to make sure that we meet the customer requirement where they need to be. And in the vast majority of cases, that'll be an on-prem solution that we'll deploy for them, customized for their environment, working with their existing tool sets as well. So we want to make sure that we leverage investments that a customer has made, both from an operational perspective and security technology stack. That's all valuable data that we would backhaul into the workbench that we use and that we propose when we're being asked to do this. So I want to make it clear that in some cases, tooling is not necessary because the customer has the tooling already, and what they need is expertise, advisory, or remedial work that we would perform with them or for them. So we'll adapt to what the customer requires us to actually do, but both are available.
Yeah, it makes sense. One size does not fit all. Everybody's at all these different stages of maturity, for sure. Okay, if you get a quality question in, you got a couple more minutes, and then we're gonna spin the wheel. You can still get one in today, but we got to consolidate the prize winners today here in a couple slides. Last poll for the day, and then we'll switch back to Q&A. So let's just run this quickly. How do you deploy remediation measures? So let's give you guys all a chance to answer that. And then we've got quite a few questions here. Looks like we probably will overflow again today as far as the number of questions we've got and the time remaining, which is always a good high quality problem that we get so much interaction today. And then we'll turn over the questions to Roger and Jay and talk about what we can do about that after the event. But we'll still get some more in for sure. Okay, I'm going to close this out and share that. Give everybody a second to absorb that from today's crowd. All right. And let's keep right on rolling. Okay, so I'll get to a couple of slides here. I will run the prize wheel. So I'll go back with some more questions. A question we got earlier was around air gap systems and inventory. Is there does an air gap system make that inventory process difficult?
Well, it depends on the asset. So if your asset is already non-centralized, whether it's air gapped or not, doesn't really change anything. You still have to visit the asset. But the only time being air gapped really is an impediment is when you have Windows HMI that you could be integrating into a agent or agentless querying capability. So realistically, for most OT environments, having an air-gapped asset is expected. Most solutions have the ability to consume information from an air-gapped asset. The question is, are you standardizing on a single solution in order to collect that information? What does that look like? So if you're collecting air-gapped information and you're consuming it into a single system that can support all that information, then by all means, it doesn't really matter if it's air-gapped or not. It's really largely those particular assets. And again, this is vendor agnostic, but it comes up all the time. A vast majority of the assets that we run into are air-gapped, and it hasn't been an impediment so far.
Okay.
I think I think an impactor here, just to add to that comment, I think an impactor here would be so localization of the site, geographical access. There's a number of things that can impact this. Vendor mix, generation mix of product that's present on the site. Those are all elements that we have to work around based on the customer constraints. Essentially, there's always ways to get the information back. The level of effort may be more considerate compared to the operational constraints the customer may have, but there is both tooling as well as service-based approaches to solving this problem.
Okay. So I'm going to spin the wheel here for our question submitters today. If you're playing the passport game, today's passport is Eiffel. It's for Gustav Eiffel. Most people know of at least one of his big projects, the Eiffel Tower and Statue of Liberty, but there's been other things. He's well known for civil engineering work that he did. And so today's code word for the passport game is Eiffel. All right, let's spin the wheel and recognize our 3 winners today for question submission. All right, so let's see who the 3rd place winner today is. And from time to time, we do remove recent winners. Some of you are very loyal question askers. So if you won recently, we've taken some of those names out, but we'll refresh that every so often. David S., 3rd place winner today. Congrats, and thanks for playing along. Let's see, 2nd place. Rupesh, awesome. I just chatted with you yesterday for the very first time, one of our new committee members. So that's always cool to see. Awesome, congrats. Shailesh B. I hope I got that name pronounced right. Congrats, everybody. I am happy that you won, and thanks for supplying some questions. All right, let me switch this back and keep going with our presenters today. Okay, so Jay, Roger, let's keep looking at the list here. Legacy systems. Now, this comes up a lot. Can you provide some insights on how to manage vulnerabilities on legacy systems where patching is not possible? This is boy, it's a common thing. It comes up in different talks in different ways, but it's more or less the same sort of question. Pain around my 20-year-old technology that I might have in place though.
Right. So your approach to legacy systems generally becomes an approach of isolation or zero trust. There's a lot of whiz-bang words around this, but if you can't affect the changes on the actual device, whether through configuration or installation, it comes down to what can I do outside of that device? What can I do on the network around it? What can I do to eventually replace that legacy system if at all possible? But yeah, you need to isolate those systems, protect those systems, remove your ability to pivot from those systems to other devices. And then outside of the active protections, you have the monitoring, right? So the more legacy systems you have, the more vulnerabilities can be running around, the more you need to monitor your systems, the more you're worried about your insider threats. So in the case of legacy systems, isolate and increase your monitoring. If you're not doing any passive sniffing, start doing passive sniffing. If you're not pulling logs from those devices, if they can't centralize log and you have to collect logs from them individually, pull logs from those devices. So you need to isolate and monitor. That's really the broad advice. Try to stay away from buzzwords, but that's really all we're doing when we do zero trust.
Yeah, I would say, fundamentally it's isolate, segregate, monitor, and then validate your controls. And I think that's where a lot of organizations struggle, is to have critical information in hand. We know that there's a number of vendors today that provide monitoring capabilities, but unfortunately flood us with alerts, right? Which makes it very challenging. And as an asset owner or as an operational security individual, to actually make sense of what I'm receiving. So I think it's very, very important that you find ways, tooling, solutions, partners that allow you to really help your focus on critical alerts that are impactful and actually contextually present within your environment that you may not have active mitigations in place. Because essentially, if remediation is not possible, then you're going to be providing either a workaround mitigation, and you need to make sure that you validate the controls that are in place. And if that requires a skill set that's not present in-house, then find yourself the right partner to help you do that. That's essentially one of the findings that we have that most often occurs with the interactions that we have with the market.
You know, this also is supported by our annual survey with 550 some respondents usually. The two things that are primordial that the most people are working on, especially lesser mature organizations, are absolutely ranked these as the highest, is asset discovery. We need to figure out what we got on these networks, and then two, segmentation. And so, Roger, if this paraphrase is right, saying like, if you got some stuff that's unpatchable, it needs to be in a segment that's pretty unreachable. Is that a fair sort of dumbed down statement?
Yeah, I push it off into the corner as best I can, but
Yeah.
a lot of these legacy systems tend to be critical systems, so you can only push them so far off to the corner.
Yeah.
So what's really interesting to me in interactions that I've had in the past is that nobody wants to do segmentation. It's a little bit like patching. It's impactful. It's expensive. It's operationally can have disruption. So essentially, finding out what you need to segment really and what you need to patch really is one of the conversations that we have all the time. And it comes up. You're right. It comes up all the time. It's a very present concern. And ideally, you're able to plan segmentation and properly understand what your segmentation plan needs to be. And there's good ways and bad ways to do that, but yeah, a top concern definitely.
So here's one of our regular contributors who's does a lot in the industry. He was raising the question around safety. He says, I hear a lot about automated actions and patching, but didn't necessarily hear any sort of reference to safety. What are your thoughts?
Do you want to take this one, Roger?
Yeah. So safety comes from two perspectives. One is unavailability of the safety network. So taking your safety systems down is not something you would normally do on an operational basis. So that's literally during downtime only. You do something that could potentially impact your safety system. The other aspect of this is that you may not be allowed to do anything on your safety network at all. All right, it depends on what the industry is for your network. I continually run into safety qualified systems that you're not allowed to change any configurations of. You're not allowed to put a patch on there. You're not allowed to change a registry setting. You're not allowed to do anything on these systems. So it really depends on what your industry regulations are from a safety standpoint. Now, paramount is the operation of the safety network, which is why you're not allowed to do anything on those safety networks. They've been qualified. But generally speaking, if your safety network is plugged into an overall plant network and you can get remote access to your safety network, I don't think safety qualification is what you should be mostly worried about. But yeah, with proper architecture, your safety systems are isolated. They are doing their jobs. They shouldn't be impacted. Your primary attack avenue, if you will, is going to be the insider threat. So when it comes to mitigating, I'm not installing patches or mitigating vulnerabilities on my safety network. You're offloading a lot of that responsibility onto your insider threat mitigation programs, your monitoring programs, particularly your physical security programs. So I totally understand the lack of allure to patching and making changes to your safety networks, but it's going to be heavily dependent upon your industry whether or not you're even allowed to make any changes. And you're not already crediting by default your physical security systems.
So I took that question a little differently, and I understood potentially the question is around the safety concern for OT environments. And we often say that IT cares about confidentiality, integrity, and availability, whereas we flip that over on an OT environment where availability is paramount and then followed by safety. We do realize that those environments are particular in the sense that an event may cause loss of life, or it can cause injury or potentially outages that will have repercussions on dependence of whatever process that we're providing. So essentially, this is a top concern as part of the risk patching evaluation that we want to concern ourselves with. Will there be an impact to this patch and what that could potentially be? So that is part of our own review process that we provide as part of the decisioning aid. that would be definitely part of what Roger would be providing as a service, or the rest of the team would be providing as a service to organizations. And it is something that substantially can be impactful in the decisioning of what we do and how we do it. And that last comment is, I have seen very, very few automated patching in OT, if ever. I've heard it often. I've heard the request from IT teams requesting this for OT. Unfortunately, that tells me that from a cultural gap perspective, there's probably things to talk about, because we don't want to automate patching except in very, very particular exceptions, patching within an OT environment.
No, Jay,
the change control process has to be very strong.
Yeah, I think that's an important share you just put out there, Jay. I think that's, and you're right, there could be requests from asset owners, stakeholders, but they're not maybe fully contextually informed requests, like, oh, we want this. Well, let's talk about why you might not want that. This is a good example. As much as that sounds good, like a headache gone away, it's automated, that must be good. Well, maybe there's some unintended consequences that would then hove into view. CVSS was not really made for ICS devices. I believe a decision tree might be more useful. Can you address this? And maybe elaborate on that if that's all clear to you.
So I've used decision trees on other projects. Cover project had a decision tree. They didn't use CVSS scores from a prioritization standpoint. Their decision tree was based off of operational impact. They had some bright line criteria that were built into their decision tree. The point is that regardless of your prioritization methodology, prioritization has to happen, right? You need to know, I have something and I've established a timeline with which to take care of it. But whether you're looking at CVSS scores or EPSS scores or any other scoring methodology, even if it's your own internal scoring methodology, the more you go with a custom prioritization capability, the more you're putting on yourself to determine what that prioritization process is, to establish the bright line criteria to be associated with that process, and to justify that process to an auditor if you're in a compliance industry, if you're actually held to a regulatory authority. CVSS can be a shortcut. It's not everything, which is why we pair CVSS scores with criticality of the equipment to get a true understanding of the prioritization. But if you're rolling your own decision tree in your own prioritization methodology, just understand that it's upon you to have a good bright line criteria that is justifiable and defensible in the face of an audit.
And I'd say that's really a good question, because essentially when we do this for a customer, we don't depend on CVSS, right? So we have our own methodology, and we'll bring actually different scoring systems to evaluate the risk and the exploitability. We have our own research as well, so which also cultivates both public and private partnerships in order to be as informed as possible on the real risk that is present within the customer environment. So definitely, I think the industry is catching up as a whole in terms of methodology for evaluating risk within OT environments, but we're nowhere near what's available from an IT perspective at this time.
Okay. It's time to probably drop an S-bomb on this conversation. It comes up all the time. So what about S-bombs? Do you see changes in the way asset inventory should be handled with the new regulations coming?
Yeah, one of my favorite discussions is S-bomb discussions, because there's a practical aspect to S-bombs, which is who's responsible for developing S-bombs. And I find it hard to believe that the owner operator of the systems has the capability of determining what those S-bombs look like, particularly the cross.
Can you back up a sec? We may have people here who don't know what that term means. Just maybe a brief.
Yeah, so an S-bomb is a software bill of materials. So I mean, even Notepad as a single application is not just a single line when it comes to a software bill of materials. There's a number of DLLs, dynamic link libraries, that are associated with Notepad just for Notepad to run. So any one of those dynamic link libraries can have a vulnerability in it. And when a vulnerability is released, we're like, hey, this library has a vulnerability. And then the question is, okay, what applications actually use that library? And it's up to the individual application developers to say, oh, okay, I'm sorry, yes, that library, I'm using that. I'm going to attach my name to this NVD. So when you see an NVD list, there's, sometimes 100 CPEs associated with that have nothing to do with each other. You're like, oh, look, Microsoft products, Linux products, this product. I mean, all these products have vulnerabilities associated or are linked to this one vulnerability, particularly when you have like SSH vulnerabilities and things like that. So an SBOM is a way for you to say, hey, downstream at the lowest levels, there's a vulnerability. And if all these SBOMs are accurate, and you have all of these SBOMs as an operator or an owner, you actually have the capability of saying, well, there is this NVD vulnerability, and I can take that vulnerability without there being 100 items in that from a CPE standpoint. I can take that one CPE that is the one dynamic link library from GitHub or wherever it is. And I have the ability, because of complete SBOMs, to be able to allocate that or associate that to every single application in my entire infrastructure that's using that. So SBOMs allow a level of granularity that bolsters an owner operator's capability of associating vulnerabilities. Now, the problem with this is that most vendors don't give you SBOMs. And as a result of that, owners operators don't have the ability to create SBOMs without tearing apart binaries. So the realistic aspect of this is the conversation we're having right now at multiple conferences, actually, is how realistic is it for SBOMs to be actionable at the owner operator level when we have things like the NVD, where we are attaching from an individual application vendor standpoint. Yes, I have an application that's vulnerable to this thing. I am monitoring my own SBOM. I'm saying I am applicable to this. So there's a practical aspect to this, which is maintain those SBOMs. Pick a standard for what an SBOM looks like. There's 3 or 4 of them floating around now from a formatting standpoint. But the practicality aspect of this is that at the owner operator level, I'm concerned with the applications. I'm concerned with what I can track, right? If I ask Windows what applications are installed on you, it gives me 20 things, not 5,000. Which is probably more the reality when it comes to individual applications. But I get a list of 20 applications that are installed. That's what I can readily identify on a regular basis through automated or manual systems. That's what I'm capable of keeping track of. So SBOMs is a vendor discussion. It is an integrated discussion. It's certainly not something that the owner operator should be jumping on top of saying, I'm going to solve SBOM. It's not within an owner operator's capability to solve SBOMs unless they're going to create a cybersecurity team that is tearing apart binaries on a regular basis to determine what those SBOMs should look like. And the fact that you have multiple DLLs that are associated with, single DLL that can be associated with multiple applications. How do you attribute that DLL to the other applications now? So there's a whole spider web there that I don't think the owner operator should be involved in. Force the vendors to do it. Force the vendors to do it through 62443. Just force the vendors to do it.
I think it's an attempt at standardization, right? Which we've been trying to do for a very long time in OT, which has been very challenging. And this would be an essential step to both accountability as well as standardization in the industry that would at least provide some sort of baseline, which we've been trying to get done for a very long time now.
Yeah. It's I find the whole SBOM area interesting because there's so much going on, and some of it won't quite work, I don't think, and some will, and some will emerge. It's like I think back VHS and Betamax, the different standards, and the one eventually wins. And I'm not predicting how all this will go, but I'm observing it and taking a lot of information and wondering how it will go. And I hear various detractors about various solutions that are saying, well, I'll never do this, I'll never do that, and I would never give this information up to that third party. It seems it's there's a lot of work to be done there, but as you guys say, it's a logical argument for someone else to be doing it. It's not something one does for oneself for the reasons you guys stated. It doesn't scale. Somebody needs to be doing it, or multiple somebodies, and then we asset owners need to benefit from that standardization that isn't here today, but maybe we'll arrive there. So I think we have time for one last question. I thought this was interesting. This is specific to you guys. Francois Detroyo asked you, is your product can it be used by an MSSP for smaller companies who don't have the resources to manage their OT environments?
Certainly.
Yeah,
go ahead, Jay. This is actually
go ahead, Roger. Go ahead.
Okay, so from a managed service provider standpoint, the question is who's allowed to have what information. A lot of the times, the information can't leave site. It depends on what the security classifications are at the site, whether on MSSP or any type of managed security services provider can be a part of that process if you have representation at site, certainly. But provided the MSSP has the asset data, our solution, other solutions have the ability to associate those assets, whether obfuscated or not. Hopefully obfuscated. You don't want secure, sensitive information to be pulled off site, but that information can be easily associated with vulnerability information, and then a host of other information. So we didn't talk about everything other than patches and vulnerabilities. We didn't talk about security weaknesses. We didn't talk about red teaming penetration testing results or dark web information or threat hunting information. So we didn't talk about any other type of information. All of that information is up for grabs. All of that information relates to your assets. All that information relates to your organization. So any MSSP can do this. We do this as an MSSP. So obviously, if we can do this, anybody can do this. It's just a matter of collecting the tool set, establishing the governance rules around it, and providing value to the owners operators as an MSSP.
So I'll be a little more directed in my answer because we're out of time, but essentially the straight answer to the question is that, so we have Service Alliance members. We do collaborate extensively. We integrate extensively with a number of vendors in market because we understand that as a core competency to handling remediation within OT environments, we do provide this information to others as well. And our workbench can be collaboratively used by partners that we do develop. So essentially, we do have a strategy for that. And I like the question because smaller asset owners have the same needs. They may not have the same means, and they need to be able to outsource some of that responsibility. My only caveat always within OT is make sure that the provider that you're working with does have OT expertise and culturally understands OT. It is not one size fits all. And as we like to say, no asset is born equal in OT. Make sure that the service provider you're partnering with has that knowledge, that sensitivity, and that cultural awareness.
Yeah, I just love the way we've ended. And I picked that question because of what you just shared. It's super important. We have all these different kinds of companies. And at the bottom of the pyramid are more companies than any, there's thousands and more, millions more. And they're the least capable typically, and the least amount of budgets, but their needs aren't less. They have them, but and there's like just rural utilities. I think I saw there's 6,000 of those. And we always think in terms of these big utilities that have major programs. Yeah, but what about the thousands of smaller ones? And they struggle. Water treatment, so many of them. And so I love that. I think I know there are solution providers that have sometimes presented their, one size fits all, and there's been people who've asked questions, we can't afford that, and there isn't a good answer from that particular solution provider for, what they do. So they must be catering to the top of the pyramid only. Whereas I do believe the way forward is we're going to have more people that do talk the way you did, which is like we got to have the right things for the right people, appropriate strategies and product implementations and partnerships, so that everybody can eventually get some of what they need versus just the few capable companies at the top of big budgets. So love that final message. Jay, Roger, thank you, and thank you, Foxguard and Framatome. Welcome aboard. This is our first thing in doing together, but we've got a year planned with you guys, and I'm excited to collaborate. Everybody I've met on the extended team, speaking on behalf of my team, it's been a real pleasure. So,
thank you, Derek. Happy to be here and looking forward to the next one. And great questions.
Yeah, and there's more. We'll give you the questions. There's some more we didn't get to, so that's always a good sign. So thank you both. Everybody, if you haven't taken you're going to get an exit survey right at the end when we close this out. It does tell us a lot. Please answer that. We do look as a team every week at the results of the previous events survey. We look at it as a group, and we look at any kind of issues or anything we need to try to resolve or make better. It doesn't always have to be negative, but we can always be improving. So please take the exit survey. If you haven't connected with me on LinkedIn, do it today and tell me how we met. If today's how we met, just give me some context so I can accept that connection. And if I or CSA can do anything for you, let me know. If you need to get in contact with Jay or Roger, let me know. I'm sure you can reach out to them on LinkedIn, but we're glad to facilitate that as well. Be well, everybody. See you at the next events, and take care, and I wish you the best.